This is Ask Congress, the show that seeks to facilitate and expand personal relationships between the viewing public and the representatives that they place in power. You know, it's our goal to create avenues of communication that will break barriers of location and nationality and culture and bring about a true sense of a global community. Today we're privileged to have on our program the distinguished Congressman Boyle from Pennsylvania's 13th District. Congressman Boyle earned his bachelor's degree at Notre Dame and his master's from Harvard. I don't know whether that's good or bad. Prior to joining the Congress, he served in the Pennsylvania State Legislature. Congressman Boyle currently serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Congressman, welcome to Ask Congress.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is your first term.
It is. I'm all of a few months into the job. So,
how do you like the job so far?
Overall, it's nice. I think I'll keep it. Although I guess ultimately it's up to the 704,000 people who live in my district or my bosses as to whether or not I will be rehired. But I like it very much, and I've always wanted. I always hesitate in saying this because people think I'm crazy, but this is what I've always wanted to do. I believe in public service, studied for it, worked very hard to get here. Didn't win when I first started out on elections, but very fortunate to be here. And so few Americans have had the opportunity to serve in Congress. To think that I'm one of them is pretty hard to believe.
Oh, how do you see this much different from your state legislature?
Yeah, so I served 3 terms in the state legislature in Pennsylvania, which is pretty analogous to here. It's a full-time legislature, meets in the Capitol 3 to 4 days a week. The state capitol is roughly a couple hours away from my home in Philadelphia, the same as Washington. So it's more similar than dissimilar. Where it is dissimilar, though, is obviously the foreign affairs dynamic. There's no equivalent to that in Pennsylvania, unless we have border issues with Maryland, and they got settled centuries ago. So really the foreign affairs aspect of it, and especially at this time,
that's right,
when we have so many serious issues going on, really there is no analogy to that in
what subcommittees are you on?
So on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and then the subcommittee is the Middle East. So we've already had hearings on the Iranian negotiations, on the war, our war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, what's going on in Libya, the unfortunate refugee situation that spills over from Syria into Turkey, the Russia-Ukraine was a full committee hearing because of Russia's incursions into the eastern Ukraine and, of course, taking over Crimea. So, and all this has literally been just within the first couple months.
Do you see any solution there?
Which, to specifically Russia, Ukraine?
No, I mean in the Middle East itself.
Well, if I had the answer to that, it would be pretty popular. I would say that I'm, and this might be controversial, but in the short term, I'm quite pessimistic. Even though by nature I tend to be an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And in the short term, I'm quite pessimistic. The long term, I'm optimistic, but I do think that it's important to remember that, unfortunately, there's still too much of a population over there that is against Israel and doesn't accept Israel's right to exist. And they've unfortunately been told through generations of leaders that, we're close to wiping Israel off the face of the map, and that's the goal. If you would have a more pragmatic leadership that would prepare a population to say, look, a 2-state solution is the ideal. 2 states for 2 peoples living side by side, accepting one another, recognizing one another. I think eventually that'll happen, but I think it would be naive to think that we're close to that.
Well, I want to shift in the area of foreign affairs to the Irish question.
Yeah.
When I was here, strangely enough, I was the leader of the Irish caucus.
I think it's appropriate, and I know, and I thank you, by the way, because in your public service career, at a very important time with what was going on in Northern Ireland and sort of human rights abuses, you're one of the members of Congress who played a leading role in why that situation's better today than it was then.
Well, do you think it is better?
I do think it is better. It's far from perfect, though. First of all, We would not have the Good Friday Agreement if it wasn't for direct U.S. involvement from the congressional level, and then beginning with the Clinton administration from the executive level. There is no way that the British and that the mainstream unionist parties would have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement if not for American diplomatic and economic pressure. And that American dimension has been extremely important throughout the last 16, 17 years when the talks have bogged down and the government was suspended. It's really been direct American involvement that has helped bring the sides together. So I do think the situation is better, but there are still crimes and atrocities from the past, tremendous human rights violations, that it's time that all parties are fully honest about and have a truth and reconciliation similar to the path they took in South Africa.
What are your prime interests? I know you talked about the question of foreign affairs, but what is your major interest?
I would say, first of all, I tend to be a generalist. This job works well for me because I'm interested in a wide variety of topics. But if I had to choose one, I would say, without question, the fact that I'm a product of an American working class, middle class, that is actually poorer today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. I'm deeply troubled by the state of the American middle class today, the fact that it's shrinking, and the fact that opportunities for reaching the middle class and staying there are lower today than they were a generation ago. That's wrong. That's not in keeping with who we are as a country. So that overall is my major concern, and things that we can do in the short term but also in the long term to address that and make sure that every American who works hard and plays by the rules has at least the opportunities that their parents had, if not more so.
Well, how do we go about that?
Yeah, well, so very obviously it's more that's the goal. There's not a simple one-sentence answer, but I would throw out a couple things I think are incredibly important to that. Education, both on the preschool side and also on the higher education side. So first in the higher education, I'm the first in my family to go to college. Got there through a ton of student loans and scholarships and work-study. Unfortunately, a higher education is far more difficult to attain today, cost-wise, than any point in American history. And we are continuing to see the middle class being priced out of attaining a college education. On the opposite side of that, when you consider that in the United States we don't have much of an education system before the age of 5, we are really falling behind when it comes to the rest of the world in that. Some states, to their credit, New York, Oklahoma, Georgia, have actually moved forward and moved toward having universally available education in the pre-K years, but too much of America has not done that. So on the education realm, that has to be a major piece of it, but then also making sure that work pays. The fact that we have a minimum wage that's lower today than at any point since Harry Truman was president, that's wrong, and that clearly needs to be changed. The fact that we have a tax code in which you can have police officers and firefighters and teachers actually paying a higher tax rate than Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Mitt Romney. That's wrong. And those are things that would have an immediate effect if they were changed today. And there are more things that we could do, but briefly, those would be the most important ones.
One of the important elements, I think, in the education field is the enormous amount of debt that a student has when they get out of college.
Yeah.
What can we do about that?
Well, first to give you an idea, and I'm not complaining. I'm lucky that I got to college and got to a great graduate school, but I'm a member of Congress now sitting here with over $50,000 in student loan debt. I'm fairly typical of my generation of folks in their 30s and in their 20s, and actually folks who are graduating now 20 years after I did are more likely to have six-figure student loan debt than 50,000. There are two things that we can do. First, make higher education more affordable so they don't have to incur that debt to begin with. Second thing is, for those who have incurred the debt, I have co-sponsored legislation that would allow a one-time refinancing of the interest rate. Elizabeth Warren has this bill in the Senate. I'm one of the sponsors in the House. Basically, it would allow for that refinancing, so that way the average student or graduate in repayment would be able to save several $100s a month. And keep in mind, they're not getting a freebie. We're not talking about debt being forgiven. We're just simply giving them the same rate that banks borrow from the federal government, no more or no less. So that is one very meaningful difference that would literally add billions of dollars into the pockets of young people, of graduates, and then that's money they could in turn use to help stimulate the economy.
Congressman, we must cut away from you for just a minute, and we'll be back to you right after the break.
All right.
We're talking about the question of higher education and the huge amount of student debt. There's been an idea put forward to extend the years of education from 12 years to maybe 14 or 16 in order to reduce, in other words, public education.
Right. So what President Obama proposed, and frankly I'm a strong supporter of, is that everyone would have, the same way everyone's entitled to a free public education for K through 8 and 9 through 12, that would be the same thing for 2 years of community college. Now, to some, this probably sounds unrealistic. If we were having this same conversation 100 years ago, and I said to you, you know, there's an idea to make sure that a free high school education will be available to every American, that would have sounded as unrealistic and implausible as the idea of 2 years of community college. Now we all accept 4 years of high school as just the standard, the norm. And by the way, not only was that a matter of fairness and help give people a ladder to climb our society, it also was one of the things that made the 20th century the American century. We recognized 100 years ago that we needed a better educated workforce, and that was one of the steps that we took. Well, similarly, in the 21st century, in order to compete globally, we do need to ensure that we're doing a better job of helping people into higher education. And this is a way we could do that. And I would point out at the same time demanding responsibility from them. It wouldn't just be you wouldn't just be able to skate. I mean, you have a certain requirements on you but the idea is that if you're keeping up the grades and showing that responsibility, you should be given more opportunity. And to me, that links very closely to what this country is all about.
Well, you were talking before about the whole question of the middle class.
Yeah.
Labor doesn't seem to have the same clout that it used to have.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's true?
I think it's deeply unfortunate. I said on the House floor just very recently in talking about labor unions that if you take from the end of World War II, you take the late 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you see the percentage of the American workforce unionized increasing, and you see middle class wealth, not the very rich, not the very poor, but your average median income, you also see that rise. Well, sure enough, once you started to see the percentage of the workforce unionized drop, you also saw the average middle class family drop in wealth. I don't think it's a coincidence that those two lines correlate for about 70 years.
Why do you think that has happened?
Well, first, there's no question that labor unions fight for higher wages and greater benefits for their workers. Now, the question is, why has the percentage of the workforce dropped? Frankly, we've had a lot of government attacks over several decades on the rights of unions to unionize, on making it easier or more difficult for them to collectively bargain, making it more difficult for them, for example, to receive dues through paychecks. Right now, there's a so-called paycheck protection bill. It's not paycheck protection. It has nothing to do with it. It's about weakening unions. That combined with the fact that we've had an economy that, as it's become more globalized, has moved away from what once were heavily unionized jobs into more white-collar jobs that are not as unionized, leaving service sector jobs that right now are not unionized. I think one of the things that could actually be transformative for the United States is seeing unionization in the service sector, like at fast food restaurants. I mean, you wouldn't have people making wages where they literally qualify for food stamps and are working at a Burger King or working at Walmart if you had unions in those professions.
But it seems that there is less interest by people generally to join a union today.
Yeah, I would agree with that, although I would point out that in the 1890s and in the 1900s it was very similar and took a real movement of pushing people, saying these would be the advantages of unionization, this is the advantage of bargaining collectively together. So we've actually seen different periods like this before in American history where unions weren't as popular. Then when people started to recognize their benefits, they became quite popular. And now we're in this era where they're on the decline. I believe we'd be better off if they came back. And I'd point out, since 9 out of 10 American workers are not in a union, we all benefit from the presence of unions. Because the fact that they're out there negotiating for wages and for benefits, that helps lift the boat for everyone else.
Well, putting your foreign affairs together with your domestic affairs and unions and such, how do you feel about fast track?
I'm not, frankly, a fan of fast track. First of all, I find it funny that I worked so hard to get here, and then I'm finally here, and there'd be a bill that's asking me to give up some of the power that the legislative branch has and hand it over to the executive branch. I think that's curious. I'm not sure why any legislator of either party would be enthusiastic with the idea of giving the executive branch a power that has always been appropriately on the legislative side. So I disagree with it ideologically, number one. And then number two, unfortunately, too often these trade agreements have not had the best interests of American workers and the American middle class at heart. I don't rule out supporting any trade deal. I recognize it's part of the future, but these trade deals have to have worker standards. They have to have environmental standards. We should be raising the standard of the rest of the world, not stooping to a lower level.
They do put the American worker at a disadvantage.
That's
because they're competing with an unfair advantage in the area overseas.
That is absolutely correct. I think it is pretty borne out by the facts over the last 20 years. And I would also point out that, if you take a look at any trade deal and you measure the rhetoric before it passed for what it would do for the American middle class versus reality, I've yet to see one trade deal that has actually lived up to all the hype. I've yet to see one trade deal that in retrospect people say, that really was worth it. The American middle class is better off today than not because of it.
How do you feel about the area of the idea of the foreign trade agreements and foreign aid itself?
Well, so foreign aid is, I imagine, never popular. It's actually a very small part of our budget. It's a very effective way for us to influence the rest of the world.
Doesn't that compensate too for the idea of balancing off against the trade agreement?
Yeah, that's the link. I tend to look at the foreign aid not so much as a linkage with trade issues, but more as an extension of our foreign policy, that we're attempting to extend American influence. Some people would call this our soft power. So instead of boots on the ground, we're attempting to use foreign aid as a positive tool to reinforce behavior that's consistent with our country's interests or our values. So I think foreign aid, and by the way, less than 1 penny per person goes to foreign aid. So the irony is that we actually spend very little money on it comparatively. I have to say, while it's probably not the popular position, I am a supporter of foreign aid. I think that it gets us more than we are actually giving out.
I want to get to another question. You're going to get the Democratic Convention in your city.
Yeah, very exciting. It's great. It's great for the city. It's a major economic boost. I'm a born and raised Philadelphian and very proud. And I'm someone who, though I lived elsewhere for college and graduate school and working in D.C., decided to come back home and wanted to have my adult life and raise my family in Philadelphia. So we're really on a hot streak. We're hosting the Pope in the fall and then the Democratic Convention come the following summer. So 2 really major events. And we beat out, not to rub it in, but we beat out New York and beat out
Brooklyn,
Columbus. Or beat out Brooklyn, right, and beat out Columbus, Ohio. So pretty stiff competition. It's great for the city. The city of Philadelphia got high grades when we hosted the Republican convention in 2000, and that was a real economic boost to the city. So I hope this will be the same.
Are you optimistic about comity within the Congress?
I am. There have been other eras of dysfunction and highly partisan Congresses that then led to actually eras of cooperation and working together. Even if you look 20 years ago, there was a lot of discord and dysfunction between George Herbert Walker Bush and a Democratic Congress. And then you obviously had a difficult relationship between President Clinton and a Republican Congress, and yet they were able to reach agreement on quite a number of things.
But how about between Democrat and Republican representatives?
Oh, that happens more than I think people realize. My experience so far, and I've talked more with more of the Republican members who are on the younger side and are newer and kind of freshmen like I am, but I've actually found that we get along pretty well. Part of it's geographical too. I mean, the suburban Philadelphia Republicans who I'm friends with and who I've partnered with actually on bills are not among the most conservative members of the Republican caucus, so that's probably part of it.
I'm sure that's encouraging to the people watching this program.
Yeah, and we actually already, myself and another Republican legislator who represents a different suburb of Philadelphia, he and I partnered together and finally got a response from the Department of Navy after our constituents waiting years and years on a very important local issue. So it shows you that when you do have a Democrat and Republican who are able to work together, you actually can produce more results than you could on your own.
You're a very refreshing element to the Congress.
Thank you.
And we hope there are more of you within the Congress.
Yeah, well, it's been said that this is the worst form of government, except for all the others humankind has tried. And so at the end of the day, the issues that we're talking about are of supreme importance.
Congressman, it's great to have you, and we hope you'll come back again in the near future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And now until next week, it's Lester Wolff saying so long from Washington.